Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, demonstrating HIPAA compliance with HITRUST Legal Advantages and New Resources Overview. My name is Jessica Brown and I will be your moderator. I'd like to now introduce our presenters. Michael Parisi, Vice President, Business Development and Adoption at HITRUST, and Adam Solander, Partner, Data Privacy and Security at King & Spalding. I'd like to now hand it over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to start with just some brief information about our organizations, both HITRUST and King & Spalding, that Adam will take you through. And we're going to dive into the agenda. Starting with HITRUST, for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are a globally recognized, industry-agnostic risk management organization. And we offer a collection of resources, tools, and programs to help organizations manage risk in the most efficient and effective way possible. Many different types of programs that are available for organizations to leverage. We'll highlight some of those as we get a little later on within the presentation, but three components that I did want to point out down below there really quickly. When you think about managing risk in the most efficient and effective way possible, one of the most foundational components is a framework, a controls-based risk management framework that has multiple different authoritative sources that really allows you to go through the compliance process in the most efficient and effective way possible, what we refer to as assess once and report many. Our framework that we refer to as the CSF has over 40 different authoritative sources included within that. For today's discussion, we're going to be zooming in on HIPAA specifically and the different components of the regulation, including obviously breach, security, and privacy that are all incorporated within the framework. There are many more. In addition to that, we provide the ability for organizations to implement and go through our assurance program and our assessment process. Hundreds of thousands of privacy and risk assessments have been completed by organizations across multiple industries to ensure compliance with different authoritative sources. The one that we were born with and we were probably the most known for and have been for a number of years is actually HIPAA, especially with the absence of an actual HIPAA certification that exists within the marketplace. We've designed our program to certify the implementation of appropriate controls to help ensure compliance with HIPAA that we'll walk you through. And it's something that organizations have been leveraging for years. We have enhanced that ability. There's some new programs that we're excited to highlight today. And lastly, as I mentioned programs, there are multiple programs, what I like to refer to as integrated yet modular, that we'll walk through that help you manage risk holistically across your organization, whether it's related to HIPAA or other regulatory components. With that, I'll go to the next slide and hand it to Adam to introduce King & Spalding.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And my name is Adam Solander. I'm a partner in the data privacy and security practice at King & Spalding. King & Spalding is a very large international law firm. One of our real strengths, however, is data privacy and security. We have been HITRUST assessors for almost a decade, I guess. It's something that we really believe in. And, you know, from a legal perspective, one of the things that sort of the law firm lens might be different than what a lot of you guys have encountered when you deal with HITRUST in the past is we think about this a little bit differently. You can see from our services, proactive counseling, incident response, litigation, regulatory. We're less interested in this from, you know, meeting a contractual requirement, sort of getting over that bar of HITRUST. The way we use HITRUST and the way we think about HITRUST is from a risk management and compliance perspective. So our goal today with sort of the lawyer slash legal lens on this is to explain a little bit about this view and how HITRUST can really help you with all the buckets here and the services that we provide. So with that, I'll turn it right back to Mike. You can walk through the agenda and we can get going on the stuff you care about.
Adam, thanks. I really appreciate that. And I'm so happy to be joined with you today. For the record, I'm certainly not a lawyer and anywhere near that. So your perspective, I think, is going to be very valuable for our participants today. Really quick on the agenda, and we already talked about introductions of the organizations and your speakers. I'm going to briefly touch upon some challenges and opportunities as it relates to HIPAA compliance that many of you live at every day. And then we're going to hand it over to Adam to take us through some very specific legal considerations as it relates to HIPAA compliance. And two words that I'm going to use a lot throughout the presentation today that Adam and I are very passionate about is demonstrating and also completeness, right? We're going to talk about the importance of those two words as we go through today's discussion. I'm going to take you through an approach that can help you ensure HIPAA compliance by leveraging different programs and resources that are available. And we'll also highlight the new resources and enhancements that we've made available to the HITRUST programs within the marketplace, give you some concluding thoughts, and then hopefully have some time for some Q&A at the end of the presentation. So with that, Jess, if we can please move forward to challenges and opportunities in slide 8. And we can move forward to the next one as well. Thank you. So there's obviously all types of challenges related to compliance with multiple regulations and authoritative sources. The points that we've highlighted here that we'll take you through over the next few minutes are certainly applicable to healthcare, but they're applicable to multiple different regulations as well. Things such as, obviously, the threat landscape. It continues to change on a day-by-day, second-by-second basis. And so making sure we understand what's happening from the increasing threats within the marketplace and the breaches specifically within healthcare that continue to impact our organizations. And that's not just traditional covered entities. The majority of those obviously are extending beyond that to business associates as well. When we think about oversight and scrutiny, I think the first thing that comes to mind is probably our regulators. But what we have seen is that there are so many other stakeholders that are within our ecosystem that are providing greater oversight and scrutiny into our compliance efforts, and specifically around HIPAA, whether those be board members, whether those be our fellow executive leaders, or whether they be customers and other stakeholders within the ecosystem. Naturally, it seems as if with disruptive technology and innovation, it's very hard to keep up from a regulatory perspective with the pace at which our resources are changing that we rely on in our business partners. New technologies, leveraging the cloud, et cetera. There's constantly new services and changes that we are leveraging, and oftentimes it's hard to keep up from a compliance perspective with those solutions that we are leveraging within our organization. The fourth bullet point there, I'm sure, rings true to many of us joining us in the conversation today. I want to start with the inefficiency, maybe circle back to ineffectiveness. Many organizations find that it's very burdensome to manage compliance across multiple different authoritative sources, and also naturally from a HIPAA perspective. Our compliance management programs are often onerous, can be very inefficient from an operation perspective, which ultimately could lead to ineffectiveness. As we look at different siloed initiatives within our organizations, we may find that with limited time and resources, we're not covering off on all the required aspects of compliance. And when we talk about HIPAA, again, I'm going to bring it back to that concept of demonstrating and making sure we're doing it completely, because those tend to be some very common challenges that we'll highlight. Guidance and inconsistent expectations, boy, this is a big one. Oftentimes the guidance and the regulations, HIPAA included, is subject to significant interpretation by all parties. When you have a high level of applying judgment and interpretation, that naturally is going to lead to inconsistent application and implementation across our organizations. With those levels of inconsistency, you're naturally going to have a misalignment of expectations, especially when we think about HIPAA and the regulator that we're dealing with. Oftentimes you may be subject to one particular auditor or one particular region that may interpret something different than somebody else within the country. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that exist there. Lastly, and what I passionately think is probably the most important and hardest struggle to overcome is third-party risk management, even for those organizations that have a very mature program from a regulatory perspective and from a HIPAA perspective internally within our own organization. There's only so much that we can control, and that big risk of understanding what's going on with our business partners and our third parties and trying to mitigate that risk and do that in the most efficient and effective way possible, I believe is one of the hardest challenges that we have as organizations relative to HIPAA and other compliance-related initiatives. Jess, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Those of you that may have seen the most recent audit report issued by the OCR right before the holidays in December of 2020, there were a number of audit findings that came out within that report. The first handful of those were really focused on notifications and completeness of information. Those are certainly important, but I want to zoom in on the last one there, which is why we've highlighted that. And as Adam and I were talking the other night and getting ready for today's discussion with you folks, when we looked at this point, we made a couple observations, right? Although HIPAA has been around for years and years and years, this is consistently probably the most common finding throughout all the different audit reports that the OCR continues to have, right? And it's organizations either not performing an appropriate risk analysis or not demonstrating that they've done all the aspects of implementing the security rule requirements from a risk analysis perspective. And what we said was, as we read this, is that we would have said it a little differently, right? What we would have said was that most covered entities and business associates failed to demonstrate the implementation of HIPAA security rule requirements for risk analysis and risk management, and we would have added completely at the end of that. And as we go on, we'll highlight why, again, those two aspects are very important for organizations as they're trying to demonstrate HIPAA compliance to the regulators. Jess, if we can quickly go on to 10. What HITRUST has done from an approach perspective, and we'll go into this in a little more detail, is that we've created a repeatable approach that can be applied to any authoritative source that exists within the framework. It's certainly applicable to HIPAA, and as I mentioned, probably what we are most known for throughout the years. And many organizations have been leveraging their HITRUST efforts and adoptions for years to demonstrate complete aspects of HIPAA compliance. Remember, these programs are integrated yet modular, and we'll take you through in the resources that are available how the framework and the programs align to the HIPAA rules from a security breach notification, et cetera, perspective. It's all about how you tell the story, right? We've really strived to make it easier for organizations through enhanced reporting and roadmaps and resources that we'll highlight as we go on today, in addition to offering a comprehensive set of those integrated and modular programs to help you with your HIPAA compliance. And remember, that story needs to be through the language of the stakeholder. And in this instance, that's really the OCR. So how do you tell the story of what you've done from a compliance perspective through their lens, in their vernacular, so they can understand the value of the efforts that you have undertaken? And with that, I think that's a great handoff, Adam, to you to provide us a perspective, and Jess, if you can go on to slide 11 for a second, around legal considerations when it comes to HIPAA compliance. So I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you. And Jessica, we move on to the next slide. I think in order to understand the vernacular and the environment of OCR and taking your HITRUST certification and, demonstrating that story in those terms, I think it's really important to understand HIPAA. Every year there's a movement to change HIPAA, to get rid of HIPAA. HIPAA is not going anywhere. This law goes all the way back to the 1900s. The drafters here did something right. They did not try to regulate privacy and security in a granular level across the entire healthcare market. The entire healthcare market is too complex for regulators to encapsulate and say you have to do X, Y, and Z and you're compliant. What they did was the scalable framework. Most of the security requirements under HIPAA come in under the risk analysis, which Mike is talking about, where it's up to you to evaluate threats and vulnerabilities and come up with reasonable and appropriate security plans to mitigate those risks and vulnerabilities. You'll often hear HIPAA described as what's called an unarticulated standard. This is exactly what that means, is they didn't try to regulate everything. They didn't try to give you a cookbook for HIPAA compliance. They put most of that on you. And that works well from a coverage perspective. That allows you to get baseline standards in place across the industry, but a lot of it is left up to the individual organizations to implement and interpret, which is what leads to those disparate results in terms of compliance programs. When you look at HIPAA, there's really three different terms that you have to understand. There's standards. Standards are things that everyone has to implement. The standard on the next page, as an example, is access control. You have to have policies and procedures in order to implement access controls in a realistic way. If you can go back to the previous slide. In addition to the standards, you have required and addressable implementation specifications. Those are the things that sit below those standards. You can see that there's really almost no articulation to that in HIPAA. You can see when we're talking about access controls, you have to assign a unique username and number for identifying and tracking user identity. You have to implement, electronic procedures that terminate electronic session after a predetermined time of activity. The problem with this lack of specificity is, questions come up. What does an organization need to do to review access rights for each individual? For example, you've created the username. How do you manage that? What is the appropriate amount of time for a logout session? All of those are things that the organization needs to implement and demonstrate in order to be HIPAA compliant. We always in the industry hear this term, we're fully HIPAA compliant. There is literally no such thing as fully HIPAA compliant under the regulations. There's just too much variation. You can have a compliance program. That compliance program can be well specified, but there really is no check of HIPAA compliance. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the safe harbor in a few minutes. So that leads to the issues, which HITRUST, in addition to accuracy and completeness, you'll hear us talk a lot today about HITRUST being a tool. And HITRUST really is a tool that allows you to add that articulation, to add that specification to your HIPAA compliance program in order to make this a compliance program that you can track, you can measure and manage. In the event of either an audit or investigation, you have a strong narrative to tell. HITRUST gives you all of that power and all of that ability as long as you're complete and accurate in your assessment. So moving on to the next slide. Obviously we can't go through an entire HITRUST standard here, but the way HITRUST works is if you're implementing HITRUST and you're doing it, you're scoping it correctly, you're implementing it correctly, it's accurate and it's complete, you will have a fully operational HIPAA compliance program that you can use to demonstrate your compliance in a very granular and effective way. At the base, there's 5 parts of HIPAA: policy, procedure, implementation, and measured and managed. The policies and procedures cover most of what HIPAA requires you to do. HIPAA requires that you have policies and procedures in most cases to address certain implementation specifications or standards. HITRUST takes it a step further and requires that you implement that and that you have oversight over that implementation. So the previous example had the standard for access control, and you can see that it was not very well articulated. There was a lot left up to individual judgment. You can see on the spreadsheet on your screen, HITRUST takes away a lot of that and gives you specific controls that allow you to implement those standards. And those standards map very completely and very nicely to HIPAA. So on the right-hand side, you can see, the HITRUST related controls and the HIPAA references. So at the end of the day, if you're doing this appropriately, you'll have a narrative to tell on Control 1Q on how you meet portions or all of the different regulatory requirements under HIPAA. With that said, the most important thing from a legal perspective is not getting over the HITRUST bar. What we always tell you to do is this assessment or your adoption of HITRUST, this is essentially the reflection, the outward-facing reflection of your information security management program. You want to be as complete as possible in your responses. So not only from a policy and procedure perspective, you obviously want those fully articulated, but in the comments that you put into the tool, in the evidence that you provide, all of that should be designed to tell a full story of how that control is met. Because at the end of the day, this is something that is, viewed by an assessor, viewed by HITRUST. They are certifying that the stuff that you put in place in your HITRUST assessment, they are certifying that that is accurate and that is there and that multiple organizations have looked at it. So you want to be inclusive, even if, for example, you're not doing measure and manage, which, we would probably recommend against, but even if those aren't controls that you're going to get scores for, you still want to assess that. You still want your assessment and your narrative of your information security management program to be complete. So you would want those comments in there. Even if it doesn't rise to the level of getting a score on a certain control, you want to make sure that you are fully articulating what you're doing from a compliance perspective. And that will come into play, in the next few slides as we talk about what OCR looks for. But at the end of the day, this is also, and I don't want to talk a lot about litigation, but HIPAA being unarticulated is a problem when it comes to litigation. While there's no private right of action under HIPAA, HIPAA does create a whole bunch of duties that businesses, associates, and covered entities have to do. In any negligence lawsuit, for example, if you have a data breach, the plaintiff has to prove 4 elements: duty, breach, causation, and damage. By being a covered entity or a business associate, you have a duty to essentially meet all the implementation requirements, all the standards under HIPAA. If there is a breach of those duties, they have to show not only a breach, but that you are the cause of this. By adopting HITRUST, one of the nice parts about that is that you can show that you've taken your duties that you've taken under HIPAA seriously, you've implemented them, and you're also measuring and managing your implementation of it. And it makes lawsuits in this area harder to prove if you have gone through the HITRUST specifications and you've implemented the entire program. So we'll move on from that, going down to the next slide. So again, just to wrap up sort of the proactive compliance portions of HITRUST. HITRUST is not HIPAA. You have to take HITRUST and put it in those HIPAA terms. HITRUST is a tool, and HITRUST is a tool, and HITRUST allows you to manage your compliance in a holistic way, and it gives you a strong narrative of how that happens. Your strength in the story that you're able to tell is reliant on the strength of your assessment. So like anything, the more that you put into it, the more that you'll get out of it. So as we talked about when going through the individual controls, it's important to get all of your evidence in there. Even if it's not going to result in a scoring increase under HIPAA or under HITRUST, it's important that you get that stuff in place. It's important that you have that narrative to tell and all the evidence that demonstrates that. HITRUST is discoverable. So again, we're back to this, scope, accuracy, and completeness. Anytime you're putting something out there with HITRUST as you're getting ready for HITRUST, you want to understand that, this may be viewed by other people. So again, you have to fully articulate this assessment. You need to make sure every point that you would want to make if you were under an audit is made in these documentations and in the HITRUST My CSF. So moving on to the next slide. So how is HIPAA enforced? This is basically the complaint process for HIPAA. When you look at HIPAA, there isn't a ton of enforcement. They don't push out a ton of fines. Since HIPAA started, there's been about 98 enforcement cases where they've extracted a civil money penalty from the individuals. But there's been over 250,000 complaints, and there's been over 28,500 investigations. So really what you want to use HITRUST for is, those compliance investigations, when they come out, you want to be able to tell that story and in a very articulate and elegant fashion, be able to show how you're meeting these requirements. Every single complaint comes in. If there's a potential for criminal violation, so if there's a criminal act, then that is going to be sent over to DOL. If there's a possible privacy or security violation, there'll be an investigation. OCR will investigate all breaches of over 500 individuals and any other breaches that they determine that they should look into for compliance or non-compliance purposes. There's essentially three things that OCR can determine. They can say that there is no violation. They can say that there was a violation, but put in place a corrective action plan, or they can issue a formal finding of violations and possibly a civil money penalty that comes along with it. What you are really trying to do here is have a strong compliance program so that when you get that investigation from OCR, you're able to respond to it quickly. Moving on to the next slide. Here's how they issue civil money penalties, and we'll move quickly through this because it really doesn't matter that much. But the penalty that you're going to have is going to be related to your culpability. One of the nice things about HITRUST is if you implement the framework and you do it in an accurate and complete way, it's very hard to show that you went through willful neglect, right? You have a program that the controls in HITRUST implement 100% of the security rule. It's going to be very hard to say that you stuck your head in the sand and you didn't look at anything. So from a risk management perspective, with HITRUST, you're really in those first two buckets. Either you did not know or unknowing violations of the privacy or security rules. So what it does immediately from that perspective is it puts you in a different category of penalties if the worst were to occur. Going on to the next slide. Here's what OCR looks for when they're implementing a CMP. And this is another area where, adopting HITRUST as your information security management program and doing these mappings to HIPAA is really important. Is they look at the nature of the violations, they look at the circumstances of the violations, they look at the degree of culpability, your prior noncompliance, the financial condition of the covered entity. This also includes BAAs, and other matters as justice may require. So essentially, they're allowed to look at the universe around your information security management program, allowed to determine whether or not the penalty makes sense. Essentially, they can make the penalty hurt based on all of these factors. Moving on to the next slide. In practice, this is how it works. You can see while there's $50,000 caps, et cetera, you can see that they can slice and dice these penalties how they want. In this particular case, related to access control, they imposed a $2,000 a day penalty for a period of time of about 2 years to deal with that. To deal with the use and disclosure violations of a particular entity, they imposed a $1.5 million a year penalty. As you can see, that doesn't line up all that effectively with their penalty calculations, so they can slice and dice these as they see fit. Moving on to the next slide. Here is what they look for, and Mike absolutely nailed it in the first slide. The number one thing that they look for is risk assessment. The number 2 and 3 things, they kind of move around a little bit, but it's always risk analysis, it's always policies, procedures, it's always access controls, and it's always rights of access. At the end of the day, OCR is a civil rights organization, and they're always going to look to make sure that individuals have the access that the law guarantees to them. The nice part about this is, these domains match up very nicely to HIPAA. So all of these requirements have controls that can show that you have a policy, you have a procedure, those policies and procedures are implemented, and that you have oversight of it. So at the end of the day, HITRUST allows you to tell that story in a very compelling way. And the areas of enforcement are things that are absolutely focused on by HITRUST. Those of you who have adopted the framework, Domain 11 is, always the largest. That's access controls. You have a lot of data points that tell how you have implemented reasonable and appropriate access controls across your organization. Moving on to the next slide. Here is what OCR enforcement looks like. And, every investigation looks pretty much the same. There's a statement of the allegation. So it'll say what the complaint is related to. If it's an audit, it'll talk about the audits and the findings. And then there are evidence requests or document requests. So you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. This is not one of my clients that found this online, but basically these are, what every single one of these requirements looks for. And I think, the first couple of these are really telling of how HITRUST really can fill that unarticulation void and provide you with some very, strong data points to respond to these. If you've done HITRUST appropriately, you have detailed narratives and you have detailed evidence requests, and I'm really excited about what Mike is going to talk about in the reporting that's now available through HITRUST to meet some of these things. But at the end of the day, each one of these, so if you look at number 11, evidence of malicious software protection, antivirus installed at the time of the incident, please also include evidence of patching on affected systems. With that control in particular, you not only have a policy that requires that you have antivirus, you're required to implement that, and you're required to monitor that, you're required to look at that on a periodic basis. So at the end of the day, what you have in HITRUST is a complete story that responds to that. It is very important that you tell that story in a specific way to OCR. Every lawyer in law school is taught this concept of IRAC, issue, rule, application, and conclusion. And in this case, the issue is whether or not you have malicious software protection. The rule is in HIPAA, which is the access control rules. The application is essentially what you've put into HITRUST. So you can reasonably conclude, if you're compliant with HITRUST, that you've met this requirement in HIPAA and you have a good story to tell them. Moving on to the next slide. This is what to avoid. This is, essentially the resolution agreement. If you violated HIPAA, these are rare, but you can see they make findings against the HIPAA privacy and security rules. So, these are good examples of, what to avoid. And if you use HITRUST, you use the resources that are available to them. I think, these types of things are relatively hard to substantiate against your organization. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide and turn it back to Mike.
Adam, thanks. Great perspective. And I remember, my years of being in professional services and helping organizations work through resolution agreements and actions. And I think a lot of your commentary around being able to demonstrate you did the appropriate things was absolutely critical. And at the end of the day, that the regulator that we're speaking about, they want to see that organizations are taking this seriously. And by undergoing appropriate actions to show that you're satisfying all of the requirements and that you are concluding on what you've done relative to those requirements is really what helps you achieve the greatest chance of success. So with that, let's talk about the approach and resources that HITRUST has available for you to leverage and implement and adopt to ensure that you can demonstrate complete compliance with HIPAA across your organization. A couple things that I want to note here. Many of these programs have been in existence for years. So, sometimes we get the question of, well, I've been using HITRUST for HIPAA compliance for the last 10 years. So what's different? What are we talking about today? Nothing is different as it relates to the approach. What is different is streamlining and enhancing that telling of the story that Adam was talking about through the lens of the OCR to make it more streamlined and easier to put it within their language. So if you do undergo an audit and if you do receive a documentation request, it's going to be much easier and outlined for you and to address all the components that they will be looking for. I mentioned the HITRUST approach earlier on within the presentation, and really what the HITRUST approach is, it's a repeatable approach to help you specify and identify the aspects of different authoritative sources, and in this instance, HIPAA, right? Understand how are you going to perform a risk analysis, specify the threats that may be applicable to your organization, and then ultimately specify and determine the appropriate controls that you need to implement and manage over a period of time to ensure you are satisfying the requirements within the rules. Also allows you the ability to assess against those requirements and report out on your compliance with those requirements on multiple different levels. As Adam mentioned before, certainly policy and procedure. Is that control actually implemented within your organization? And what are you doing in order to measure and manage those controls over a period of time to ensure continued compliance? All of that is supported by the programs that you see on the left-hand side. It's a list of all the tools and resources and programs available to organizations to ensure and demonstrate complete HIPAA compliance. But to highlight a few, because those that are familiar with HITRUST programs, you're going to see some new ones on this list that you haven't heard of before that we'll cover in a few minutes. I do want to highlight HITRUST My CSF. This is, again, an assessment corrective action plan SaaS-based platform, and it helps organizations in implementing the framework, performing an appropriate risk analysis across the organization. In addition to that, there's been several enhancements that we'll show you some screenshots of included within the platform to produce HIPAA guidance, scorecards, enhanced scorecards, and really what we are referring to as a HIPAA compliance pack that will show you aspects of new enhanced reporting that was not available previously and is available to all My CSF subscribers with the new release that we will be sending out here shortly. The third one, the HITRUST Regulatory Assistance Center, this is brand new. We have a whole slide on this that we'll cover in a few minutes that we're very excited about. It's designed to help organizations ensure regulatory compliance, especially as they may be getting ready to undergo an audit or as they are in the process of undergoing an audit, and staffed with multiple individuals and organizations to help you tell that story, determine how you leverage your investment, your HITRUST efforts to show that compliance. Threat catalog, very relevant. One of the main areas that we've seen in themes over the last several years is that although organizations may implement controls to satisfy the requirements of HIPAA, identifying threats is a key component of that process. I think Adam mentioned before, and we'll go into in a little more detail. If you do not identify the applicable threats to your organization, you're going to run into an issue with the regulator, which is why we've introduced the threat catalog several years ago that integrates into the control framework, and part of our checklist and part of our HIPAA implementation guide that we'll show you here in a few minutes talks about the steps that you need to go through in order to determine what threats are relevant to your organization and then map to the relevant controls from an implementation perspective to satisfy the requirements of HIPAA. Also, the third-party assurance program and the HITRUST assessment exchange. Third-party risk management is one of probably the highest areas of concern for organizations when you think about compliance with HIPAA. Going back to the days of Omnibus and how the rules changed, gone are the days of that one-page business associate agreement where we can just point our finger in the other direction and say it's the responsibility of somebody else. And there is a requirement and there is an expectation that we are applying appropriate diligence relative to the third parties that we are currently working with or that we are selecting to work with in the future. So making sure that we are obtaining appropriate security and privacy assurances from our third parties is critical as part of that equation. And I think as most of us know that are joining us for the conversation today, oftentimes the breaches that we see the vulnerabilities that exist or that our environment is exposed to are linked to a third party and are not necessarily linked to our own implementation procedures. So we can't stress enough the importance of that as it relates to HIPAA compliance. Jess, if you can move to the next slide for me. This is a snapshot and a subset of all the authoritative sources that are included within the framework. I mentioned it's over 40 plus authoritative sources that fall into multiple different categories. Those would include other control frameworks. They would certainly include regulations, whether those be federal, global, or statutory, HIPAA being an example of a federal one. And then it would also include other standards such as PCI, et cetera. As you can see, breach notification, privacy rule, and security rule are all included within the CSF and harmonized across that standard set of requirements that you can select. One thing I did want to note, and actually we already had a question come up during the presentation, can I leverage HITRUST for just HIPAA compliance? The answer to that is yes, you certainly can. You have the ability to perform what we refer to as targeted assessments by leveraging the My CSF assessment platform, where you can select any of these individual or combination of these authoritative sources to build an appropriate assessment scope that helps you show compliance with that one particular authoritative source. So yes, you can do that, and you can do that in the form of scorecard reporting, which has been enhanced through the changes that we are making to My CSF, which Jess actually brings us to the next slide, please. It's a great segue. Again, those familiar with the HITRUST My CSF platform, it is an enterprise risk management platform. It is helping organizations to really streamline the implementation of appropriate controls and programs to manage risk across their organization, and also supports you from a corrective action plan management perspective, and also from a reporting standpoint against any of those authoritative sources. Some major enhancements that we have made specific for HIPAA that will be coming at the end of Q1, this compliance and reporting pack for HIPAA. We're going to show you what that looks like. Again, this is everything that we've been talking about during the beginning of this conversation. How do we arm organizations to tell the story appropriately through the lens of the OCR? For organizations that may be just starting their journey, how do we provide them guidance relative to implementing and adopting HITRUST programs and how those link to the requirements of HIPAA, all included within our implementation guide, and then ultimately our compliance and reporting pack that we'll show you within a few minutes. In terms of specific information required by HIPAA that will help you from a regulatory perspective and having a defensible position, and that's all about how you document, as Adam mentioned before, clearly what you've done within your organization to satisfy those requirements by undergoing a HITRUST assessment and by undergoing our assessment process. You are by default doing that. So it's just pulling together what you've been doing or what you will be doing in order to reflect it within the reporting mechanism necessary to satisfy the requirements of the regulator and also give you a defensible position. Can't stress enough the importance of concluding. Again, Adam and I were pontificating about this last night as we were getting ready for today's webinar, and oftentimes, organizations will show, well, this is what we've done from a controls perspective. Here's the aspects of HITRUST and the CSF that we've implemented, and here's our scores, and this is how it maps to the requirement. The regulator wants to know, how do you conclude? So with everything that you've done, do you conclude that you have met this requirement? And we have, again, enhanced the platform to force you to make those conclusions so that when you do produce the reporting necessary, you're able to satisfy that requirement in terms of what the regulator is looking for. And this is all done in an automated fashion from a compliance perspective. And again, our goal is to make this process, as any other risk management process and compliance process, the most efficient process possible for you by streamlining as much as we can. And for those familiar with the My CSF platform, there are different subscription tiers. This is an enhancement that we are making across the board, regardless of what subscription tier an organization may have. Jess, let's show a few screenshots of what these enhancements will look like. As you can see, that the new aspect that we have here, those familiar with My CSF are probably familiar with the screen around the different regulatory factors that you can select and deselect. Remember, HIPAA is now a selectable regulatory factor. So that does a few things. One, you need to make sure you do, in fact, select it. It is not included within the scope of your assessment by default. And two, it also helps you to select a targeted assessment if you wanted to do something just against HIPAA and produce appropriate scorecards as part of your assessment process. You'll notice in the bottom there what we've added. Would you like for My CSF to produce that checklist and that scorecard specific for HIPAA? Again, this is new. By selecting that, it will give you that roadmap and the new reporting that is in the language of the OCR, and it hinges all of the different components together relative to the requirements within the standard. Jess, if you can move us to 27, please. We've designed the process to guide you in documenting everything necessary to be successful with the regulator. Remember, that regulator wants to know how you did it and how you conclude. So making sure that the appropriate comments are implemented relative to the security program that you have in place, for example, and how you conclude against the different results of the assessment against the requirements will be captured from an overall reporting perspective for the regulator, which brings us to the next slide. This is where it really all comes together. This is where you tell the story through the language of the regulator. And I know it's probably hard to see. We do have some additional mock-ups that we can send to individuals as a follow-up to this, and this will be the output. This will be your scorecard, but also could be the checklist that you use from a compliance perspective. A few things to note. Captures all the relevant data sets and information needed to be provided to the regulator. It also gives you redundancy, right, in terms of the different types of controls that you may need to have in place to satisfy certain implementation specifications. You can tailor this based upon how you draw your conclusion. And what I mean by that is, if you probably can't see the details of the second component there, but I can tell you what that specifically outlines is when you look at the HIPAA security rule, there are specific safeguards and areas that must be addressed. And for the sake of this slide, the example that we're showing you is administrative safeguards. Underneath administrative safeguards, there are a series of standards or implementation specifications referenced by certain ID numbers. And that standard or implementation specification, again, may be related to, say, risk analysis. It may be related to a specific aspect of the standard. We highlight that based upon what's included within the rule. In addition to that, what you will see is a description of what the standard or implementation specification is directly within the rule. If we take the second one as an example, apply appropriate sanctions against workforce members who fail to comply with security policies and procedures of the covered entity or the business associate. We indicate whether that is required or whether that is an addressable component. From there, it will pull in the scores of your assessments associated with that particular specification linked to your HITRUST specific controls, in addition to the HITRUST CSF requirements and then the HITRUST CSF requirement description. So in this instance, if we think about what we're trying to satisfy here from a specification, are appropriate sanctions applied? Have they been applied within the organization? And when you look across the CSF and what organizations will need to assess themselves against, or become assessed externally by an external assessor, there are more than one control requirement statements that help you achieve that implementation specification. And in our example here, all 6 have been mapped to this implementation specification. So what does that do? That gives you the ability to show there are multiple actions that you have taken in order to satisfy this requirement, and also reflect where you are fully compliant, where you might be measuring and managing. In addition to that, it's going to pull in your commentary. It's going to talk about how you did that, another aspect that the regulator wants to know. To the extent that you've undergone an external validation by your assessor, it's going to pull in what your assessor did in order to validate what you did to address those specifications. And then it's going to specifically link all the supporting evidence that was looked at or referenced by you and also your external assessor to support your conclusion around whether you've addressed those requirements or not. Many different elements that are available with this, in addition to new data sets such as the threats that you've selected to use through the threat catalog to the extent that you have, that will outline it in a form and in a vernacular that the regulator wants to see and needs to see. In addition to that, Jess, if we can go to the next slide, please. We're really excited about this brand new program for us, what we're referring to as the Regulatory Assistance Center, that will be available for all organizations that have a current HITRUST certification, and if you are preparing for or undergoing a regulatory audit. Now, although we are talking specifically about HIPAA today, this is available for various types of regulations, anything associated with the authoritative sources that are included within the framework that is available to you. And what we've designed this to do is that throughout the years, and we've received multiple questions from organizations to say, look, I made the investment in HITRUST, I've been doing this for a number of years, and now I'm undergoing an audit, and can you help me understand how to use what I've done in responding to this through the lens of that regulator or through the lens of that stakeholder? And we've provided a series of guides and guidance throughout the years to help organizations build that story themselves. But we felt as if it would be more valuable to the ecosystem if we can really work side by side with those organizations to help tell the story better. So something new that we are offering. It's going to be staffed by various professionals, again, not only security and privacy, but also attorneys, right, individuals like Adam to help guide you through that process, and experts that are familiar with not only HITRUST, but all the different regulations, especially HIPAA, to help organizations through that process. And you can see a link here. It is live. You can start engaging with the Regulatory Assistance Center at any point in time. We're really excited about this new program, and we think organizations will see a lot of value by leveraging it now and also in the future. And Jess, if we can move on to the next slide, please. As I mentioned before, a number of other resources that are available, some guides as it relates to how does the HITRUST approach map to ensuring HIPAA compliance? How do you ensure you're covering and performing an appropriate risk analysis and also addressing the implementation specifications? And so those guides are available to you. You can download them from our website. We've included the link here. And of course, this would be very relevant for organizations that are just starting their journey down this path. Quickly, Jess, if we can go on to the next one. Leverage the guide for an explanation of enhancements within the checklist itself, right? So when you think about the HIPAA compliance guide, it's going to outline all the detailed instructions and steps that you need to take relative to leveraging HITRUST programs to ensure and demonstrate complete HIPAA compliance. Remember, the biggest caveat, scope. You got to make sure that the scope of your HITRUST assessment is going to match the scope of what the OCR is looking for from a HIPAA compliance perspective. And all these steps will provide a list of the references and also the actions that you need to take in order to address those HIPAA implementation specifications. And Jess, on to 32, please. In addition to the checklist itself, the checklist is something that you can use up front for organizations that are starting the process. When you think about the risk management process that you need to go through, the risk analysis guide that's already been documented within HHS from an implementation perspective, all resources that are available to you if you're starting your journey. If you are already HITRUST certified and you're wondering, how can I use the efforts that I've already undergone, you can back into this, right? So you can use the checklist to understand the steps that should have been taken and compare that to what you did take to actually highlight where some of your gaps may exist within the scope or within the process that you performed, or where maybe no gaps exist and you'll be in a position to be successful. Lastly, what I want to highlight just on the next slide is those of you that may have seen the new HIPAA safe harbor law, again, that got released prior to the holidays. This is a game changer. This is new. We certainly told the regulator how thrilled we were with the information they provided relative to this. But the important thing to note when you read the law, it specifically indicates that in order for organizations to qualify for safe harbor, they must provide evidence that they've actually done the things to meet the requirements. And what that really translates into is you must have a robust assurance program in place, which is exactly what we offer through our integrated yet modular programs for organizations to ensure HIPAA compliance and to help you qualify for the new safe harbor law. So Adam, I don't know if you've got any comments or perspective on that before we head to conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'll be quick. And, the safe harbor will suffer from sort of the same issues as HIPAA compliance in general. Remember my comment, it's very hard for an organization to say, hey, I'm fully HIPAA compliant without some sort of evidence underlying it. So there will need, organizations in order to take advantage of the safe harbor will need to implement, a HITRUST certification, have that control framework that shows those specific bullet points that would allow HHS to determine whether or not that safe harbor is appropriate. So I think, this is a game changer for us, and really it's just more value to the certification.
Great. Thank you, Adam. So with that, I know we are at time, and I know there were a series of questions that we did not get to. Jess, we are going to have a process where we've captured all of those questions, and we will get back to the participants with applicable answers. Is that correct?
That's correct. We will follow up with everyone on your questions that we weren't able to cover on this call.
Okay, great. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited about these enhancements and new tools to make this process more efficient, more effective for you, and certainly excited about the Regulatory Assistance Center and further help and guidance and engagement from professionals within this space, such as Adam and King & Spalding, in addition to a number of others. So thank you for your time today. The slides will be shared at the end of this presentation, and we look forward to responding to any questions we did not have a chance to get to, and you have our contact information there to the extent that you'd like to reach out directly.